Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Hard Things Podcast. This is your host, Blaine Burgess, and this is number 79. Um, I believe it's going to be called Lex Talionis, and there's good reason for that. So, this series of episodes, as I mentioned last time, a little episode called Creating Space on JFK. I'm also creating space, releasing episodes 2 weeks apart, giving myself some more time to consume data and really learn and contemplate about these episodes and share what I learn. I think a lot of times before I would just kind of hop on and freestyle. It would just be my own brain. Sometimes maybe I felt like I had a lack of understanding of some things or things I learned a long time ago. I kind of, forgot the true facts of the story, the things that I thought I remembered. So I took a little bit more time with this episode, and it's a little different because episode 1 was coming in a little bit late, and then the second episode was due a few days ago. But now it's been a week since Martin Luther King Day, and I've been able to flush out the first 3 episodes of this little series. And I knew it was going to be its own little pod, so to speak. And it's because there's 3 players at play here. So Lex Talionis, if you know what that means in Latin, it means eye for an eye, essentially. And famously, Gandhi said, an eye for an eye makes the whole world go blind. And this was a quote kind of at the end of the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. I went about a year ago. So I've really been contemplating this one for a long time. But the connections that's kind of where they are. So we have Gandhi, who influenced a lot of world leaders. It's verified that he influenced Martin Luther King. That's what this episode's about. But I'd imagine too, JFK, kind of to put a ribbon on last episode, if you think of those monkeys, like see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, I think JFK is kind of hear no evil in the midst of the Cold War, kind of the highest tensions, through the embarrassment of Bay of Pigs and the following year with the Cuban Missile Crisis. I recently revisited the themes of Oppenheimer and the creation of the bomb. And if you don't know anything about the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, essentially that was a really tense moment where we had missiles in range of Russia, Moscow, and Cuba was adopting communism. And essentially, if nukes made it to Cuba, they would be in range of the U.S. And then we'd really have, we already kind of had mutually assured destruction, but we would be able to bomb Russia, but Russia wouldn't necessarily be able to bomb us at the time. And so this was an escalation of the war. And I think a lot of United States folk would prefer kind of preemptive strikes. I mean, that's kind of always been United States is, idea of world peace is we have our finger on the trigger and we're not going to push it. But other people, maybe rightfully so, don't feel secure. Yeah, that's a lot of trust. So wanting to have their own nuke and have their finger on the button too makes them feel better, but ultimately we just all got a lot of really big guns pointed at each other. And so I think what's interesting is with JFK, in a time where he had a lot of support for kind of a violent path, he chose to try to reach out to Russia, Khrushchev, and de-escalate, take kind of a more nonviolent approach, kind of in the midst of these little mini violences. And Cold War is, there's no open war, but, we eventually got into Vietnam and Korea, and there's a space race, so we're fighting proxy wars, but not actually having open engagement. Just pointing, like I said, really big guns at each other. So some people would argue, I read a little bit about this in preparation for this episode too. Some people would argue that just the approach of peace was very, very important for JFK to do, because he could have easily allowed things to spiral out of control. So he kept things in check, but ultimately paid the price for it. At the end of the day, when you choose nonviolence, odds are someone violent is going to object, especially if you're in power. And oftentimes you're in power because you are level-headed and nonviolent. So there's a lot of JFK conspiracy theories out there. I do believe, no matter what the mechanism was, he did something radical and paid kind of a radical price for it. And that's humanity, baby. That's showbiz. Not to trivialize his death. It's something I wish wasn't a feature of mankind, but seems to be pretty consistent. We have not learned that lesson yet. We have not found a way to be nonviolent and stick with it, and not punish people for, doing that. And ultimately, we said, we have nothing to fear but fear itself last week, as a kind of a major JFK quote. And of course, when you choose nonviolence, you're just left with fear. Violence ultimately maybe makes fear go away for a short period of time, but the fear really never goes away. But trying to convince others to not be afraid without the benefit of your own life experiences and access to the leader of Russia, so to speak, it's just a lack of trust and an abundance of fear. So ultimately, though, people credit later presidents for ending the Cold War, but I think John F. Kennedy kept it from boiling over. He gave us the chance to finish that fight. So, very good, sir. So there, I couldn't find any direct talk of JFK crediting Gandhi for direct influence, but I felt like that was a great segue into two other men, JFK, Gandhi. We got into Lex Talionis. We got into an eye for an eye, makes the whole world blind. The next episode is going to be all about Gandhi, so we're not going to spend too much time going over his stuff. He's going to be later. So this episode is about Dr. King. And we talk about JFK hearing no evil. I think Martin Luther King saw no evil. And that takes a special individual, for someone who was so about nonviolence and would put himself in the midst of violent situations to prove basically that he was indeed nonviolent. Quite skillfully, I might add. So, first and foremost, I wanted to talk about Martin Luther King growing up. So what I thought was interesting is he went to Morehouse College after high school, like very quickly, and graduated very young, went to seminary, graduated seminary very young. So around the time of the Montgomery bus boycotts, which is, Rosa Parks fame, Martin Luther King was already a pastor, but he was just getting into the civil rights movement, and people found him charismatic, but he didn't really have, he hadn't like cut his teeth yet. He didn't have all the skills that he would earn and later use. So I thought it was interesting, like a kind of like a, origin story of Martin Luther King. So I found some sources that talked about early on, he felt protection with weapons was a thing. And that brought me to first and foremost, trying to figure out where I want to start here. So imagine the young king. I think a lot of times these great men who follow kind of deep and difficult philosophies. Really, this episode, it's Lex Talionis, eye for an eye, but it's him using what could maybe be described as his third eye, to decipher situations. Mystics and spiritual people often talk about synchronicity. You see like certain numbers on the clock or coincidences in your life or whatever it may be. And his story was kind of an interesting one that I thought, was kind of like that. And it shows that like our choices in life are honestly, basically just a choice to be involved, total involvement. And so the signs are going to come to you and you can either participate or not participate. And someone like Martin Luther King just continuously chose day after day to participate. But in this case, it was being confronted with the ideas of Gandhi and not only taking them in and pondering them with the benefit of his education behind it, to compare it to other scholars and such, but to actually get excited about it and get motivated and see it as an advantage. And so that happens when it's the magic of people. So there's very smart people that came before you. They learn certain things. They have certain life experiences, which excites them. And so without, basically you respect a person, you have a feeling about this person, maybe inside your body. And then an idea that they're excited about, you kind of get excited by proxy, I guess. But I don't believe that it happens spontaneously. Like, you kind of have to be exposed multiple people over time. It kind of brings up to me the idea of, no man steps in the same river twice because it's not the same river and it's not the same man. There's instances in Martin Luther King's life where it just comes back to him kind of time and time again. So the way I understand it is Martin Luther King he first experienced kind of the idea of civil disobedience, which is central to what Gandhi had done. Gandhi, in a way, if you look at, we're going to talk about it in the next episode, but he was all about, like, there's laws, right? And there's, universal laws, like kind of the 10 Commandments kind of thing, like thou shalt not kill, don't steal, etc. And they're pretty widespread. A lot of different religions and countries and whatever follow them. And what's funny is the law, like man-made laws, are kind of like sillier and more restrictive. Like, example, American Revolution, the Boston Tea Party was about taxes on tea. So we just wanted to drink our tea and not be super overcharged for it. That's not the same as don't steal the tea. So like they stole the tea and dumped it in the harbor. But in response to the other law, and instead of taking the tea and just using it per normal, they dumped it in the harbor to make a point like, hey, we're just going to light this money on fire then. And so that's civil disobedience. It's not like a thou shalt not kill. There's really no way to justify just a straight up killing of a human being, maybe aside from self-defense or defense of another. But that's kind of a deeper topic. Civil disobedience is kind of more about breaking like ticky-tack laws. So this guy, Howard Thurman, was a professor of Martin Luther King at Boston University. But he met Gandhi back in like 1935. So that was kind of the first time he was exposed to it. And maybe had heard of Gandhi. It's not really for sure. But then we get into president of an HBCU, Howard University. Definitely a famous one. I think Dr. King at the time was not yet Dr. King. He was trying to be studying at seminary in Pennsylvania, and he went to Howard for a sermon on Gandhi's life and technique. And so here's this guy, Mordecai Johnson, president of an HBCU. As cool as Howard Thurman was, his professor, then there's this guy beyond, kind of the ultimate level of a professor would be to become the president of a university. Mordecai Johnson, gives a captivating speech about Gandhi and just grips him. And because he had exposure previously, it was almost like the influence of Howard Thurman plus Gandhi plus the fact that, civil disobedience seemed like a kind of a good way to get people's attention. I think, layered on top of Mordecai Johnson's speech, now he's kind of, in a way, we got this like pile of tinder, right? And it's now under a stack of wood. We built ourselves like a good campfire. And over the years, studying philosophy, doing everything he had to do to become Dr. King, They said, I watched a documentary, they were talking about his dad wanted him to stick to the gospel when he was preaching in their church. And he would always talk about Nietzsche or, philosophers, like people that had nothing. I mean, Nietzsche said like God is dead. So it was kind of studying the enemy, so to speak, for a preacher, and just kind of on a base level. So, I found it interesting. So he was highly educated in philosophy. So he has Gandhi floating around. And recently, I believe it was in the last year, there's a movie called Rustin. And it's about Bayard Rustin, who, this kind of brings us to the Montgomery bus boycott. So, like I said, Dr. King was 26. He's brand new to the scene, wanting to get involved. People loved him. And for whatever reason, Bayard Rustin was there. He was involved. Ends up being a close advisor to Dr. King the rest of his life. But he was adamant about nonviolence and Gandhi. And because Martin Luther King had already had this exposure with Howard Thurman and Mordecai Johnson, he kind of said like, hey, this is, now this is the other guy who wants to advise me is talking about Gandhi also, and kind of just brings it all together, in a time where it would be really easy to be angry, much like JFK. It'd be really easy to just go full warmonger and DEFCON 5 against Russia. Martin Luther King says essentially like, nope. And I find it interesting. He must have, I think a lot of times, especially in like mid-20s, human beings are looking for ways to assert their power. And so you have this like, I know this was true of me, which is why I'm saying this, and I've noticed it in other people, but we're looking to maximize our personal power in the world. Sometimes we overstep. Well, also, I think everyone has a conscience and this like moral authority, and people fall all along that spectrum of balancing those two. Because I think it's really important. If we want to do great things in our life, we need to channel our personal power while also not giving up morality or just like the universal laws. Like, if I have to kill someone to get power, that could be a really easy way to establish power in some way. But do you want to sacrifice everything? Like yourself, your soul, to get it. Like there's a way you could get power feasibly, maybe you don't know about, that wouldn't involve killing anyone. So the struggle is worth it to avoid this moral collapse. But people, I think I find in life, like do all kinds of things to compromise their structure. And killing is a very extreme version. But there's ways that we kill people, like not physically. Like example, if you work at a company and you kind of betray, a coworker politically, you're maybe both vying for a promotion, and you kind of kill their reputation, so to speak. That's a way to gain power. But you should try to win on your own merits of your hard work and your ability to win favor with people, kind of naturally. So all that to say that Martin Luther King jumped in on the Bayard Rustin train. And I think this, over time, that relationship developed, and they solidified themselves on the nonviolence train. And eventually, the March on Washington happened. I Have a Dream speech. And really all the way through, I think there were times where it was tempting to kind of come off of nonviolence or maybe not be as disciplined. Speaking of I Have a Dream speech, I read it over, and there's one passage where he mentions dignity and discipline. This man was ultimate. I think people talk about sometimes, like we talked about JFK, like there's a couple stains in terms of infidelity, him always being on the road, and people kind of sympathize with it. Some people kind of discredit him for it. But I think ultimately, like, discipline's a very difficult thing. And oftentimes, what I find in my own life is if I'm disciplined in one area, I'm typically very undisciplined in another. So I can spread it evenly and be slightly undisciplined everywhere, have a couple moments of weakness. Or I can be disciplined almost everywhere and then have one area of my life where I'm just not. Like, there's been times where I, train super hard, for example, eat super well, but then I'm stressed and I can't sleep. But I get sleep well, I get food right, and maybe I let the foot off the gas in training, Or I sleep really well, I train really hard, but then my diet is poor. And I could do all three of those things 85% and still not really get the results I want. So all I'm trying to say, I'm not trying to justify him being unfaithful, but to not give into violent impulses, which I'm sure he had because he's human. And people around him, sometimes he would be at marches, and then some of the people there would start looting. And people would kind of criticize him and say, hey, you justified this looting. And Martin Luther King would back it up and be like, wait. Like, I did not sanction any of this. These people were acting on their own, taking advantage of the situation kind of thing. And this documentary I watched, even, he had, there's this organization called SNCC. I think it's like Student Nonviolent something. And basically this guy, I actually don't want to mention his name because he was kind of working against Dr. King a little bit, which is, it can be good to have, some resistance or some opposition, so to speak. And this gentleman had kind of started using the term Black Power. And the documentary shows how Martin, didn't want to feed into Black Power because he saw it as divisive. He said the response to white power isn't Black Power. It's just power. And it's like, we want power. White folks want power. We can all have power together. Like, if we have Black Power, then we're back in the same situation, just with the kind of the other side of the coin flipped. So, and that's he did it honestly and took a stand too against the Vietnam War. And it wasn't a very popular thing to do. Like, there's a lot of times where he would kind of get heat and a lack of support because he wouldn't just give in. But his thing was nonviolence, and he applied it everywhere. And like I said, like, it was very difficult and required a lot of discipline. And it's something that I personally struggle with, I mean, there's times where, you get frustrated in life. Someone that's close to you or not close to you is just acting in a way that you find to be asinine or otherwise. And it's hard to be, there's lots of forms of violence. Like, I'm not physically violent with anyone. But you can say things. You can do things. Sometimes the absence of doing things, like just ghosting someone, that's violent. There's a lot of forms of violence. And, to live in a way where your message is consistent like that. I mean, thank goodness. I mean, I would love to see Martin Luther King in the era of social media, just to see if he could, keep it up as strictly as he did. I think it'd be really interesting. But a little bit of infidelity at the end of the day, a lot like JFK. As much as he had on the line, what he was taking on, you're bound to crack somewhere. I mean, human beings crack. And again, that's not to justify, that's not to let anyone off the hook, because you can't let yourself off the hook. But you do when you inevitably fall or sin. You got to be able to bring yourself back. You got to be able to deal with the consequences and make a commitment at that point. Sometimes things get out of hand. And yeah, I think Dr. King was a great example of, in general, sticking to the plan despite great resistance, everything that he tried to take on. And it's a reason why there's so many things named after him now. And he's got his own federal holiday. So, say what you want, but it impressed a lot of people. And by impressed, I mean impression, good, bad, ugly. He left an impression on the United States of America. And again, like, he went to the heart of darkness in a lot of ways. I mean, he grew up in the American South. And then this documentary talked about him going to Chicago. A lot of times, Chicago's a northern city. You'd kind of expect maybe a little bit more tolerance. They were part of the North in the Civil War. And all he found was segregation, black people in ghettos. And, he moved into an apartment in Chicago where they were doing work there. And they said they were afraid of the whites and the blacks there. Like, it was so lawless in the slums that you were in danger, and you're also in danger from racism and other forms of segregation at large. So he was kind of surprised, they said, about how it was almost worse to him than the South, maybe because he had higher expectations. But yeah, so all that to say is this man stared into kind of the heart of darkness on many occasions, publicly, privately, and he was able to avoid Lex Talionis. He did not seek to take an eye for an eye. He did not seek black power in the absence of white power. I think he exhibited black power. The power to ask for 50% from his white brethren, and not any more, not any less. He wasn't trying to collect for sins of the past. He was just trying to equalize for the future. And a lot of what's happened in the past, those debts, we could flip slavery on its head, have black people own white people, allow them to do with white people what they wish for just as many years as the slave trade. You could put people on boats and take them over to Africa and just reverse it. And I just don't think you can ever, it's an unpayable debt. And really, maybe the only way you can pay it back. And I've thought a lot about, as a white man in America, like, what can I do to pay it back? And if anything, it's just to adopt, the true symbol of Black Power, I think, Dr. King. It's adopt his stance. I want my share of what I'm supposed to get in this life. It's not necessarily designed or doled out by myself. I don't determine that. It's definitely a divine intervention type thing. In the instance of me and, say, like Dr. King, if it was just the two of us, I think we'd be able to shake hands and say 50-50. And I think that was his design, his vision. And just because it's 60-40 or 70-30, and I give up that 10 to 20% to meet him in the middle, it doesn't mean that I lost. Like, it was never mine in the first place. We're born with inherent value and dignity, and instead of trying to grow that at all costs, at the expense of others, even, I think it's our job just to be able to accept it, find something on this earth that we enjoy. I personally feel so blessed that I found chiropractic, the fact that it's even a possible career for me. Chiropractors that came before, similarly to Dr. King, they fought, they were civilly disobedient. They got arrested for practicing medicine without a license. They went to jail. They did a lot of the same things that civil rights people had to do. And now the result of that is I can go to school, and I think sometimes at school it's going to end up being like $250,000 of debt for some people like myself. And it's a lot of hard work. It's a lot of busy work, or work that other people determined is what I need to do to become a chiropractor. And now that I'm halfway through, I know enough about chiropractic that, it's easy to see that a lot of times we're focusing on the wrong stuff. It's not a balanced approach to school, but the only way to get through it, not just survive it, but actually become a chiropractor, is to just be grateful that we even got this opportunity. There's so many people that struggled and got arrested and things, so we can have this. And the same goes for Dr. King. We're at where we're at today because people like him struggled and fought, were civilly disobedient, and produced change. So for us to get into the next kind of phase of the world, we have to have courage, discipline, and be willing to take stands when the time comes. And even if all your brothers deviate and leave you, you got to have the courage to keep it going, because if you keep those doors open, you keep that train moving, the brothers can hop back on. Sisters too. So I think that's where I'm going to leave it for today. But at the core of all that, Dr. King being willing to look the heart of evil straight in the eye, and you don't do that with your two soft, mushy human eyes. I think you do it, like I was mentioning earlier, with that third eye, almost like a sixth sense of, what's right. And we partially have Gandhi's example to thank for Dr. King. So now we've honored JFK and Dr. King. Next time we're going to honor Gandhi, kind of the legacy of that style of civil disobedience. So I'm going to go. I've already done a lot of research on Gandhi today with the MLK stuff, but I'm going to go finish up on Gandhi, and I'll see you guys in February. I was trying to think of the exact date. I don't know the exact date of the episode, but February it is. I think it'll be like February 5th, maybe. So until then, I hope you like thinking about these things, and we'll see you next time.